Hey, it's Michael Douglas. Welcome back to another episode of Dr. Pundit, where we talk about music, not medicine. And I want to talk about George Harrison. George Harrison, I think, was one of the more down-to-earth of the Fab Four. He kind of told you what he thought, and he was really pure about what his overall feelings were to the type of music he made, and was very humble about his success, not showy or flashy like the other three on some level. And he was kind of my favorite Beatle in that respect. And this is kind of an editorial on why he was, quote unquote, fed up with the music industry in the 1980s. And this really kind of resonated with me because that's when I began to find out about his music starting in 1981, when I actually bought the 45 vinyl record to his top 5 smash all those years ago. And so I've been following his career, off and on. Of course, it came to a newfound success in the late 80s. But, everybody, well, mainly everybody, knows the name George Harrison, right? I mean, he's one of the most famous guitar players of all time, and of course, a former member of the band, the Beatles. He was an innovator, he was a trailblazer, and a musician who extensively experimented with a plethora of different sounds. Now, one decade of music that isn't known for this type of musical experimentation, at least in a macro sense, is the 1980s. And by the time this decade had rolled around, Harrison was well underway into his solo career, by a good decade or so. Specifically, he had released by that time All Things Must Pass, Living in the Material World, and Dark Horse, as well as 3 other albums. He was cranking out music, but in the 1980s, he kind of dialed that back a little bit as he only released 3 solo albums the entire decade. And of course, the one I referenced earlier was his Somewhere in England album, but he then recorded an album in 1982 called Gone Troppo, which I really like the title cut to that album as well. But there was a 5-year hiatus between that album and the 1987 album, which brought him his second #1 hit, Got My Mind Set on You. That album was Cloud 9. Now, there's really no definitive reason why his output slowed down in the 1980s. I'm not here to really profess why, but in the 1980s, he was interviewed by Guitar Player magazine, and in this interview, he expressed his displeasure with what he called business antics and redundant musical tropes of the decade. Regarding this, Harrison told the outlet, "I was fed up with the record business, which partially, I suppose, my own fault, because I just got tired of having all the responsibility and not having somebody else to bounce off of, but also partially because of the way it was going." In terms of the music, George Harrison further explained his displeasure by stating, "Of course, there's stuff now that I do like. I mean, there's always been some good stuff that I enjoyed, but the massive stuff, it all just sounds the same to me. I got so sick of it." George Harrison's grievances with the 1980s music industry seemingly revolved around 2 main themes, what he called categorization and redundancy. And as we know through both past comments and his diverse music, George Harrison, really wasn't a fan of either of those things. He attested to that fact in this interview, saying, "Just all this marketing thing, how everything has to be a certain way, otherwise you don't have a chance of getting it on the radio." Now, of course, luckily, Harrison got to break away from this mold when he released the 1987 album Cloud 9, but he also began to work with the Traveling Wilburys, which was another late 80s supergroup with him, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne, following the release of their first album, Traveling Wilburys, Volume 1 in 1988. This kind of sentiment by George Harrison about his relative antipathy, maybe that's too strong of a word, I guess displeasure is a better word, for 1980s popular music in general, was echoed by Wilbury's bandmate, the late Tom Petty, when he was interviewed by Guitar World in 1992. And, he basically said George Harrison, didn't get a buzz from popular music at that time. He was, it seemed like George Harrison was in his own kind of cocoon or bubble, for what that's worth. That's my take on it. Tom Petty was asked by the outlet as if any contemporary bands struck him as having a bit of the same spark as his early heroes, and George said no. I can't say that I've heard anything that gives me buzz like some of the stuff that we did in the 50s and 60s. The last band I really enjoyed was Dire Straits on the Brothers in Arms album. To me, that was good music played well, without any of the bullshit. Tom Petty also recalled that George Harrison really didn't have much of an interest in rock music past 1957. The thing he was proudest of was the Beatles. He said the Beatles put out such a positive message. He was appalled at the things being said in pop music, and once he got into his Indian music, that rock and roll music to him was in the past. I don't think he had much interest in rock music past about 57. Ultimately, I feel George liked Indian music the best of any genre, and it certainly had influences in his music as well. And this was including rock. However, he always made his music sound unlike anybody else's. And I think that's part of the mystique surrounding George Harrison, which I find him very fascinating, and his musical output. And it's really interesting to think about his concerns in the 1980s about how, while they're important in the entire scheme of things in music history, it seems kind of quaint today with all of the issues surrounding AI-generated music today, further fragmentation of music today, artist compensation of music today, from streaming services. Everything is just more complex. And personally, I think George Harrison's head would have been just totally blown today if he were still alive. So, pretty interesting story about him. And I'm Michael Douglas, and if you like what you see here on the channel, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. And as a late great Barry White always used to say, let the music play, and I'll see you on the next episode.